Chapter 14. When they reached the East Beach, Autumn practically leaped out of the cart and ran to the water. Bill could barely glimpse the bumps beneath her fluttering sundress before she was waist deep. He glanced at Nicholas. Guess she was in a hurry. "Come on!" she shouted to the others, waving to them before breaststroking further away from shore. Bill didn't want to go that deep. In fact, he wasn't sure he wanted to be neck deep in the water, let alone unable to stand. He'd had enough fun in that department for the week. "Well," Philip said, turning to Janet, "guess you shouldn't keep her waiting." "Guess not," she said, and scrambled out of the cart. She didn't run like Autumn, but walked quickly into the ocean. "What about you?" Philip asked Bill. Janet swam out and joined Autumn in the water, the pair floating some 60 feet offshore. "Think maybe I'll stay in shallower water," he said. "Had enough of the deeps, so to speak." Philip laughed good-naturedly. "Way I heard it, you weren't in more than 20 feet of water, right?" "Yeah, more than enough." "I hear you," Philip said. "Fish give me the willies." The pair left the cart while Nicholas retrieved chairs and towels from the racks. In a few minutes he had set up 4 lounge chairs and 3 beach umbrellas and produced a cooler of drinks. Without removing his sunshirt, Bill waved to Philip and waded slowly into the water. Goosebumps traveled up and down his body as the water rose. He couldn't decide if that was because of the water's temperature or fear. But what was there to be afraid of? Crabs, he thought. Crabs and wriggling worms. He shivered again in the heat. When he was waist deep, he bent his knees and let the water come up to his chest. Philip waved to him as he sat beneath an umbrella, a beer in his hand. Bill felt foolish, but returned the wave. A cloud moved across the bright sun, and the day dimmed, the deeper water turning to slate. He located Janet and Autumn and watched the pair for a moment. Instead of swimming, they tread water over a good-sized brain coral, their eyes occasionally glancing into the depths. It sounded like they were having fun. While he didn't have a mask, it was easy to see fish swimming in the shallows. He even spotted a hermit crab, which made him swim a little faster. Autumn and Janet noticed him. "Come on," they called. Like sirens, he thought with a grin. It was an amusing image, but somehow apt. Autumn looked like a mermaid in her sundress, while Janet looked like a model for an SI calendar shot, her nipples clearly visible through her bikini top. "Fuck it," Bill thought, and swam lazily in their direction. He occasionally slowed and looked down at the fish. The schools thinned the further away from shore he traveled. Confused, he continued swimming. By the time he reached them, he couldn't even see crustaceans on the ocean floor. It was as if every animal that could flee had abandoned the area. "About time you got here," Janet grinned. "Your cuts hurt?" Strangely enough, they didn't. "I'm good." Autumn playfully splashed water at him. "Now that you're here, want to swim to the grotto?" It was only 200 feet or so to the grotto entrance. He thought he could do that, but something made him anxious. Maybe it was the look in Autumn's eyes, or the idea of being alone with 2 beautiful women in a dark space. Both. What would Ellen say? Probably keep your hands to yourself and have fun. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's go." Autumn didn't waste a moment before going supine and kicking her legs. She swam like some kind of sea creature, her arms and legs moving in concert. Janet sighed. "Wish I could swim like that." "Not me," he said with a chuckle. "It'll mean I spent way too much time in the water." Janet giggled. "Nothing bad about that. Come on." With that, she followed Autumn, albeit at a much slower speed. Sighing, he started swimming. Autumn disappeared inside the grotto. By the time Janet followed her in, he was only halfway to the cave. Muscles burning slightly, he needed to start working out, he continued puffing his way to the entrance. It looked like the face of some howling monster rather than just a hole in the rock. Fighting a sudden swell of fear, he swam inside the mouth and finally noticed the dim torches on the wall. The grotto wasn't pitch by any stretch of the imagination, but shadows yawned and flickered on the walls. Autumn had moved further inside, halfway to the cave's rear. Janet followed slowly, her eyes scanning the walls. The rocky and corrugated surfaces changed shape in the shadows, some looking like faces or mythical creatures. He knew it was just the flickering lights causing the illusion, but they made him anxious. Bill put his feet down and stood, head barely out of the water. At least it wasn't as deep here. Autumn finally stood at the far end of the cave, the water only to her breasts. He could walk now, and he did, half expecting an errant fish to brush against his legs, but fauna didn't appear to be in the grotto. "Come back here," Autumn shouted, her words echoing across the walls. "It's neat." Janet swam a few more feet before standing, the water up to her shoulders. The shorter woman continued walking until she was waist deep. He continued forward, hit a rock with his toe, and grunted with pain. Maybe he should swim to them instead of walking all that way? Without being able to see the bottom, it was impossible to keep from stepping on invisible hazards. Instead of swimming, he further slowed his pace, walking with tentative, exploratory steps. "Hurry up!" Autumn called, the echo making it sound as though she were behind him, as well as in front of him. Janet joined her, and soon a chorus of women's voices beckoned him inward. Sirens indeed, he thought, unsure why gooseflesh rose on his arms. When the water reached his nipples, he stopped. "This is far enough for me," he said to them. "Already stubbed my toe on a rock." Autumn pouted extravagantly. At that moment, she looked like a streetwalker working her next John, all but calling him a homo for not paying her for a fuck. "But we're over here, and I hate talking loud." He raised an eyebrow at that. She wasn't nearly as boisterous as Philip, but she was hardly a quiet person. "Nah, far enough for me. Besides, I think I've seen it all. Not much to it." That was both true and a lie. He liked the way his voice rattled around the cave's interior and the flickering lights. It made him feel as though he were somewhere in Europe instead of smack dab in the ocean. But he didn't like the way Autumn was acting. She was actively coming on to him, and it made him uncomfortable. Jesus, if Ellen saw this, what would she say? Possible catfight, he thought with a grunt. Janet moved closer to Autumn, the pair little more than a foot away from one another. "You sure, Bill?" she called to him. "We don't bite." He blushed, feeling foolish at being so nervous. What was the harm? 1,000 mini-movies played through his skull. Everything from Ellen walking in on him, embraced by 2 women, to the pair of them drowning him. Shut up, brain. He finally shook his head. "No, my cuts are starting to hurt," he lied. "Going to head back to shore." Autumn smacked her fists violently in the water before saying, "Your loss, honey." He waved to her and slowly swam back out of the cave. He was near the mouth when he heard a cry behind him. He turned and saw Janet's hands splashing beneath the water as though she were trying to shush away an annoying insect. Autumn looked at her with an awkward grin, but her head was raised as though in exultation. Janet finished splashing and shouted, "Fucking thing bit me!" "You all right?" he called into the cave. Janet immediately dove into the water and swam hard. He hadn't thought she could move that fast, but she was even quicker than Autumn. "I wouldn't go in there," Janet said. "Something wriggled into my bikini and bit me." "Jesus," Bill said. "Sounds like the thing that got Russ." The crab. The worms. "Let's get out of here." He and Janet turned and swam out of the grotto and into the ocean. They quickly turned to shore and covered the 70 feet in no time. Once the pair could walk, Janet immediately headed to the lounge chairs and her husband. Bill scanned the ocean near the grotto but didn't see Autumn coming out. "Bill, where's Autumn?" Nicholas called. He shrugged and pointed. "Still in there, I think." Nicholas shook his head and unbuttoned his shirt. "She knows she's not allowed to be alone." He looked gravely at Bill. "Please stay out of the ocean until I return, both you and Janet." "We will, I promise." Nicholas grinned. "Very good." He grabbed his life ring and the coil of line and ran as close to the grotto outcrop as he could before walking into the ocean and swimming inside its mouth. Autumn rested near the grotto's back wall. The water was quite shallow, leaving her calves exposed. She ran her hands down her body, lifted her skirt, and gently touched the eggs surrounding her labia. She quivered as electric tingles spread across her flesh and fired her mind. Moaning softly, she touched herself again and nearly orgasmed. Her first egg had broken, and now Janet was infected. Pity she couldn't convince Bill to come further inside the grotto. It would have made things easier. Ellen had asked her to infect Bill in any way she could. Now that he'd escaped the grotto, she'd have to find another way to get him in the water. She grinned seductively in the shadows. That shouldn't be too difficult with the right motivation. Ellen could probably help her with that. She looked at the cave's mouth and the bright light outside. For the moment, she dreaded going back out there. The cool, wet grotto made her feel safe in the same way Russ used to. Russ. He was changing. She didn't know into what, but his scent was different, transforming from sexually inviting to a powerful musk that was as foreboding as it was comforting. Russ would protect her. She heard splashing outside the grotto entrance, and a moment later, a shadow swam inside. Autumn? Nicholas called. Perfect, she said quietly. I'm back here, she called, her voice bouncing off the walls. Nicholas continued swimming, the life ring bobbing along the water behind him. After 24 feet, he stopped swimming and stood. You need a swimming buddy. She smiled demurely, the shadows playing across her face. Will you be my buddy? Of course. She walked toward him, the water quickly deepening enough for her to swim to him. It didn't take long to reach him. A moment later, one of her eggs cracked. A few seconds after that, Nicholas was infected. Janet sat on the edge of Philip's lounge chair, a bottle of beer in her hand. It was disgusting, she said to her husband. He stroked her hair and shushed her. Where did it bite you? She didn't want to tell him it had bitten her beneath her bikini, or the fact that she felt something slither into her pussy. A short, sharp sting had followed in its wake, along with a deep ache in her belly. She barely made it to shore without completely panicking. Beneath my bikini, she said. Frowning, he lightly gripped her shoulder. That can't be comfortable. She wiped a tear of embarrassment and disgust from her eye as Bill approached. Bill, you see what happened? Philip asked him. He shook his head. I didn't go all the way in there. I was on my way out when it happened. Autumn must have gotten bit too, Janet said. Although, had she? She hadn't made a sound or even reacted. Why was that? Bill blinked at her before a slight frown overtook his face. I think you should see the doctor. Now. Philip narrowed his eyes. Why? He stared back at the mouth of the grotto. Because I think whatever bit Russ bit Ellen too. And Autumn. So? She asked. So? Ellen and Russ have both been ill. The last word came out of his mouth as a whisper. Philip growled low in his throat. You saying it was venomous? Nodding, Bill turned back to them. I think it was. Venomous? She thought. Am I already sick? Philip glared in the grotto's direction. As soon as Nicholas gets back on shore, we're going to see the quack. She followed his gaze and saw two forms swimming away from the cave, the life ring trailing behind. Sanaa passed Kingston in the dining room hallway, and her pace immediately slowed. She'd had sex with the man dozens of times, and she knew his scent by heart. But this was different, somehow more alluring, so much so that she stopped and turned. Kingston? He stopped in the hallway and turned to her. Yes, Sanaa. She took a deep breath, her every nerve vibrating with need. The image of him in the shower with her, him kissing her from neck to waist, entered her mind. So many times it had been like that, but only in the ocean. Covering the few feet that separated them, she immediately cupped his crotch with one hand. He moaned, his nostrils twitching like a bunny's. He lowered his head to her neck and breathed in her scent. Next break, she said softly as he nipped at her earlobe. Meet me in the locker room. A sigh escaped her lips, her loins on the verge of orgasm. Not yet, a voice said in her mind. Soon. They'd never dared to kiss in public, let alone fondle one another in the hallway. Can't hear, she said, as his hand brushed against her crotch. Can't, he echoed dumbly and stood back from her. Soon. Soon, she agreed. He nodded and walked past her with slow, dreamlike steps, his normally upright posture slightly hunched. Another sigh of want escaped her lips before she walked into the laundry. She was barely able to focus. The urge to touch herself was almost overwhelming, but so was the thought of having Kingston touch her. It'll be better with him, the alien voice said. It will? The voice didn't answer. Before today, she'd never heard that voice, but that was okay. It was comforting to have help. Whenever she didn't know what to do, the voice told her. It continued talking. She listened. Sometime later, her watch chimed, and she immediately dropped the clothes she was folding into the basket. They'd be rumpled and creased, but she didn't care. Sanaa left the laundry and immediately strode into the locker room. Kingston was already there, his clothes hanging from the racks, his penis fully erect. Something about it didn't look right. It wasn't as large as normal, and his testicles had swollen. Stiff white hairs waved in the air from his pubis. He was beautiful and sexy, and she had to have him. As she undressed, he moved to the shower and started the water. He patiently waited for her. He didn't have long to wait. Bill sat outside the main house on a bench, eyes glaring at the thick foliage below the rise. He didn't know what the doctor had said to Janet. She and Philip didn't share that, but she'd received a course of antibiotics, just as he had for the coral cuts. Parasite was the word that kept repeating in his mind. But could one be transmitted through a bite? The strange crab's sac had practically exploded with wriggling snake-like worms. If one of those bit you, did it leave a parasite behind? Was that something that happened in nature? He thought it likely. Maybe the worm was merely a carrier, a stage of life that existed only to pass on the parasite. If that were the case, the dozens of worms he'd seen explode from the crab all carried it, each one capable of infecting another animal. Perhaps dozens of them. If Russ had been infected, Ellen certainly had. Now Autumn, Janet, and who knew how many others. Even Nicholas had complained about being stung once he had returned from the grotto. Autumn had said nothing, only shaking her head when asked if she'd been bit, a confused smile on her face. The few words she spoke had been uttered in a robotic cadence with little inflection. She didn't sound like herself, nor did she look like herself. He'd seen that bump again when she came out of the water. If he hadn't known where to find it, he would have missed it entirely. But now he knew for certain it wasn't an optical illusion. Something was growing on her. Parasite. The word crawled through his mind, making him remember images of tapeworms and hookworms from high school biology. You contracted those from infected food or unclean environments, and in both cases, the parasites fed from within their host. He didn't think either manifested any exterior characteristics, but that didn't mean a parasite couldn't. Eggs, he thought. Those had been eggs beneath the crab, and he didn't think they'd been the crab's own clutch. And the way it acted, the come-hither gesture, had been uncannily human. And the moment he put his face near the water, the eggs had exploded, and the worms had streamed out at him. If he'd been in the water, he'd have been bitten. He'd have a parasite growing within him. Like inside your testicles, he thought with a shiver. And then what? He'd grow eggs? He gave a low chuckle and held his head in his hands, fingers coursing through his thinning hair. This was crazy. The very idea was insane, and so was he for even entertaining it. The crab, the eggs, the worms. But how the fuck would it cross species? He thought if that were a common occurrence, he'd have heard of it, or been warned of it by the staff at the very least. But Mina said she'd never seen such a crab or heard of one like it, and she'd worked the island for more than a year. No, this was something else. Maybe something new. It didn't matter where the crab had come from, only that it had somehow infected his wife, and Russ, and Autumn. And now Janet and Nicholas, he thought. That made 5, but were they the only ones? To Bill's knowledge, Philip had never gone into the water, and certainly not deep enough to come across the strange crab, or to allow an egg to... He raised his head, mouth half open. Fuck, he whispered to the jungle. It's not the crab. That's how it might have started, but now it was something else. Ellen and Autumn had egg sacs. You're crazy, he told himself again. It can't be egg sacs. That's insane. It was, but it was also the only thing that made sense. Antibiotics. Those would kill the parasites, right? If they were vulnerable externally, maybe plain old hydrogen peroxide or something like that would do the trick. It's not, though, and you know it. If it were just the eggs, he might convince himself the parasite was simply attached to their skin. But the behavioral changes, the bumps in their bellies, Russ's sallow, grayish skin, and the hunch of his back all pointed to something more insidious and possibly permanent. Ellen, he thought, wiping away a tear. If I lost you... His skin prickled in the heat at the possibility. If he could kill the parasite, could he save her? And if not, what would happen? What the hell was he supposed to do?